Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us today in what we hope is our timely panel, Palestine and Free Speech, Activism, Advocacy, and the Law. My name is Aliyah Khan, and I'm Director of the University of Michigan Global Islamic Studies Center. We are your hosts today. I'm also an Associate Professor in the Department of English and the Department of Afro-American and African Studies here at U of M. I'll begin by introducing the Islamic Studies Center and what we do, and then I'll acquaint you with the event and our speakers, and then give the floor to them and to our moderator. The Global Islamic Studies Center aims to promote the understanding of global Islamic culture and Muslim societies worldwide, not just the Middle East, but Asia, Africa, and the Americas. We are an academic unit at the University of Michigan, but also a community member in Southeast Michigan. If you're a student, faculty, staff, or community member who's interested in our events, make sure that you join our newsletter and keep up with us on social media. But in addition, if you're an undergraduate student, we encourage you to declare our Islamic Studies minor, which has no prerequisites and it's 16 credits. You can find out more about that on our GISC minor page on our website. If you're interested in graduate programs, please check out our master's degree in International and Regional Studies with an Islamic Studies specialization. The master's program is 36 credits total over the course of 2 years, and you can check us out also on our website. Also, as a reminder, if you don't know what we do and who we fund, if you are a U of M student or faculty member looking for funding for a project or event, our applications are open to undergraduate students, graduate students, and faculty at every level who are looking for funding for projects related to Islam and Muslim societies and communities, including in the United States. We fund events and any projects related to Islamic studies and Muslim societies. This includes travel, conference fees, language learning courses, internships, and more. Our applications for funding close on April 29th, so make sure you apply before then. In collaboration with the Arab and Muslim American Studies program in the Department of American Culture and with Dr. Suad Abdul Khabir, 2 years ago, we launched our Black Islam Graduate Student Fellowship, which supports research, language learning, travel, and conference engagements related to Black Islam and our Black Muslim communities anywhere in the world. The application deadline is also at the end of next winter semester. Next semester, in winter 2024, we have a number of exciting events to look forward to. There are 2 in-person community events in which we are collaborating with Southeast Michigan bookstores and businesses. First, our ongoing Kahwa, meaning Coffee and Authors book launch series, which will feature young adult Muslim American authors reading from their work at 27th Letter Books, which is an independent bookstore in Detroit. Also at Cups and Chai Tea in Canton, we'll be holding Michigan Professor 5-minute community flash talks, in which we'll ask what's new in Islamic studies. So stay tuned for more info. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for today's event. This panel on Palestine, free speech, and the law is brought to you by the Global Islamic Studies Center and co-sponsored at the University of Michigan by the Program in International and Comparative Studies, or PICS, and the Digital Islamic Studies Curriculum, or DISC. So on to today's event. Palestine and free speech, activism, advocacy, and the law. I wanted to take a minute to introduce a word on the genesis of this event. The Global Islamic Studies Center is a U of M College of Literature, Science, and the Arts academic unit whose students, faculty, staff, and their families have been seriously impacted by the recent political crisis in the Middle East and resulting disruptions on campus, including by harassment incidents directed personally toward us and our students, as reported to the university. Many U of M community members involved with our center are Palestinian, Arab, and or Muslim Americans, especially as you know, the university is located in proximity to and draws many students from Dearborn, home to the largest Arab American community in the United States. In discussions with faculty and students in our unit and across the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, as well as with colleagues at U of M Dearborn and MSU, we identified a strong need for legal clarifications on U.S. campuses in the present moment. This desire for information on the law coalesced around multiple issues. They include free speech on campus, uncertainty about congressional actions on free speech in the United States, campus activism and protests, loss of employment prospects for students engaged in activism, bias in administration responses from universities, religious and racial discrimination, immigration, visa, and citizenship concerns, relationships with law enforcement, and safety in person and online, including everything from physical violence to doxing. Please note at the bottom of your screen, especially for U of M students, a QR code linking to U of M's safety tips and policies on free speech, protests, and demonstrations, which is important for everyone on campus to know, regardless of your politics or your beliefs. As educators, we seek first to educate and inform our students and Michigan community about the world in which they live, so that they have the tools to balance the dual concerns of safety and justice. I'll now introduce our three speakers and our moderator, and then they'll take it from there. Our first speaker, Ellie Savit, serves as the elected prosecuting attorney for Washtenaw County. Ellie has dedicated his career to public service. He formerly served as a law clerk to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was a civil rights and public interest attorney, and started his career as a public school teacher. Most recently, Ellie served as the City of Detroit's senior legal counsel, where he led criminal justice reform work for Michigan's largest city. Ellie is also a nationally recognized attorney who has led public interest lawsuits against some of the country's toughest adversaries such as banks, the opioid industry, slumlords, and corporate polluters. Ellie continues to teach in person at the University of Michigan as a lecturer at the law school. I also have to add that meeting Ellie in person and hearing his sincere interest in working with youth and his commitment to free speech rights was another spark for this event. Our second speaker, Fadel Nabilsi, currently works as a senior associate at H&H Law Group. Mr. Nabilsi is a Palestinian American attorney, and we are proud to say a University of Michigan graduate of the class of 2016. At U of M, he majored in International and Comparative Studies and Near East Studies with a minor in Arab and Muslim American Studies. Post-graduation, Mr. Nabilsi completed a year as an AmeriCorps Vista volunteer and worked as a research assistant at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. He continued on to law school at MSU College of Law and became a licensed attorney after passing the Michigan bar exam in 2021, and he has been an attorney in good standing in Michigan since then. Our third speaker, Amy Doukoure, is a staff attorney at the Council on American-Islamic Relations-Michigan chapter, CAIR-Michigan. She obtained her Juris Doctorate from the University of Detroit Mercy Law School, where she was president and one of the founding members of the Muslim Student Lawyers Association. She's also a graduate of Wayne State University with a degree in English language arts. Before obtaining her JD, Mrs. Doukoure worked for over 10 years as an educator in the Detroit area, including at the area's Islamic schools. She's passionate about community service and has worked as a pro bono legal associate for the Detroit Center for Family Advocacy and with the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU of Detroit. In 2022, Mrs. Doukoure accepted an award from CAIR's National Office for outstanding legal advocacy on behalf of Michigan's Muslim community. Finally, our moderator today is Dr. Murad Idris, Associate Director of the Global Islamic Studies Center and Associate Professor of Political Theory in the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan, where he teaches classes in the history of political thought, war, empire, and Islam. He is Palestinian. Dr. Idris is the author of the multi-award-winning book, War for Peace, Genealogies of a Violent Ideal in Western and Islamic Thought, published by Oxford in 2019. War for Peace tracks how discourses of peace across the canon of political theory from Plato to the present work to sanitize violence, justify hierarchy, and police dissent. Dr. Idris is currently writing a book titled Islam in Theory, Scripts of Unfreedom, Fanaticism, and Violence. As a reminder, finally, we will have a Q&A session after the presentations. The chat is disabled, so please submit your questions at any time during the presentations using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. Your questions and comments are visible to the panelists, but not to the general audience. However, once questions are answered, they will be visible to everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and we hope that you find this panel helpful and illuminating. I will now turn it over to Ellie.
Well, thank you so much, Aaliyah. As mentioned, I'm Ellie Savit. I'm the Washtenaw County prosecuting attorney, and I'm just going to use my time to give sort of the basics around some issues relating to free speech, and particularly free speech on campus. Before I do, I'll just note my both professional and personal interest in this topic. Obviously, professionally, I'm the Washtenaw County prosecuting attorney. That means that we have jurisdiction to prosecute all effectively violations of state law that occur in Washtenaw County. We also have an obligation to uphold the Constitution. And as it pertains to free speech, that's something we take really seriously. We have a proud tradition of history and protest and advocacy here in Washtenaw County. And it's something we try to give wide berth to avoid trampling free speech rights. Of course, there are times where, something can arise out of a political demonstration, such as an assault, something like that, that is not protected by the First Amendment, and that will come to our office. And so, I think the best way of preventing things like that from happening is to be clear and precise around the rights that everybody enjoys and their limits under the First Amendment. But, more importantly, personally, this is an issue that's tremendously important to me. As Aaliyah mentioned in the introduction, my background is as a civil rights attorney. I believe strongly in the First Amendment and the right to protest and the right to organize. And, I was a student activist myself. I press the limits sometimes myself, and I hope that ultimately my presentation, the question and answer session, can help to inform people about what exactly the law is as it pertains to free speech, as it pertains to activism on campus in this state, in this country, because my fervent hope is that folks are able and feel confident in expressing their beliefs around this issue, around any other issue, and that they know, that everybody knows the precise protections that they enjoy, the limits of those protections, what can and can't be done by universities, by state actors, by federal actors, and we can continue the tradition, the proud tradition of advocacy and activism in Washtenaw County on U of M's campus, and that everybody can feel safe and comfortable and confident in expressing their beliefs and in advocating for what they believe in. So with that, Aaliyah was kind enough to give me sort of 4 prompts to guide my discussion, because I think I only have 15 minutes here, and you ask a lawyer to talk about something as complex as the First Amendment, I'd probably go on and on forever. So I'm just going to use this time to try to answer those, which I think get to the heart of a lot of the concerning issues that are bubbling up right now, and then hopefully if there's anything that is unclear that remains to be clarified, we can address that in the question and answer. So the first sort of question prompt that was passed along is, what is the law in regards to free speech rights of students to protest about political issues on campus? Are campus spaces different from public spaces? And the answer to that is yes and no. The First Amendment, which protects our right to free speech, applies only to the government, right? It does not prevent any private entity from taking action against somebody because of their expression of speech. That said, public universities, like the University of Michigan, are governmental actors. And so just like any other branch of government, they are bound by the First Amendment, and they cannot abridge free speech consistent with the First Amendment. Now, there are several exceptions to the First Amendment's protection of speech. There are several types of speech that are not protected by the First Amendment, and that means they can be punished by any form of government, by the federal government, by the state government, and indeed by the university. As relevant here, the three real major exceptions to the First Amendment, the three types of speech that are deemed unprotected by the First Amendment are A, inciting imminently unlawful activity, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. B, defamation, which is false statements harming another person's reputation. And C, true threats. And we say true threats in the law to differentiate it from, a sort of joking threat that nobody could take seriously. Something like, if you're late again to class, I'm going to kill you. That's not a true threat. Nobody could really believe that was intended to cause a fear of great bodily harm or injury. And so a true threat is somebody that somebody has the requisite intent to convey, right? Conveying a threat, and that would reasonably cause the person that hears it to be in fear of a great bodily harm or death. Those are the three things that, generally speaking, the government, which includes the university, which includes public universities, are able to prohibit, are able to penalize. Now, beyond that, universities are bound, at least public universities, are bound by the First Amendment. And that means that they cannot abridge, with those exceptions, they cannot abridge free speech or free exception, or expression, rather. The most important thing to note is that universities, like all forms of government, can impose what's called time, place, and manner restrictions on how speech is exercised. So, for example, what the university could do is say, if you want to have a protest, you can't do it in the dorms at 11 o'clock at night. That's quiet hours. We don't allow that form of speech in the dorms there. That's a both time and place restriction, right? They can prohibit using a bullhorn, for example, in the library, which would make a lot of sense. Now, what they cannot do, and this is really where the rubber hits the road, is they cannot make content-based restrictions on speech. So, for example, if the university allows one student group access to the DIAG in order to have a political protest, they cannot prevent another student group from doing so based on the message that student group is going to convey. The same is true with, for example, the use of university resources. If the university generally allows student groups that are advocating for particular positions to make use of classrooms, to make use of university resources, to invite speakers, to have events, to hold protests, what have you, they cannot selectively deny that opportunity based on their disagreement or uncomfortableness with the content of what's going to be said, with the content of the message. So anytime any level of government engages in content-based restriction on speech, that's what's going to run afoul of the First Amendment. You can't selectively apply your rules, and that's true even if there's some sort of pretextual reason, right? So for example, you can't say, well, you can't have a pro-Palestine rally on the diag because we're concerned about the noise, if what the university does for other groups, right, is allows them to have those same rallies. So that's the general strictures that bind universities. Again, public universities at least are bound by the same First Amendment that binds the state government, the federal government, and prohibits the abridgment of speech. That brings me into the second sort of prompt that I was asked to talk about, which deals with one of the exceptions that I mentioned earlier. One of the forms of speech that can be prohibited, that can be penalized by the government and indeed by a university, which is inciting imminently unlawful activity. And the question is asked, what exactly constitutes inciting imminently unlawful activity, violence, say? The answer to that question was answered by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio. And the standard is very, very high. It is very difficult for the government to prove that somebody was inciting imminently unlawful activity. There's basically three things that need to be shown by the government if they are going to prohibit or penalize that type of speech. One is that the advocacy was directed to inciting imminently unlawful activity. That means that somebody effectively had to have the intent when they said something to get other people to break the law. So if you say something without the intent to have people react in a way that they're going to break the law, that doesn't qualify. That's protected First Amendment speech still. The second thing is that it needs to be imminent, right? So simply encouraging people, even if you're doing it intentionally, to break the law, to engage in unlawful activity, if it's down the road, doesn't qualify as inciting unlawful activity and remains, in fact, First Amendment protected speech. I'm not sure I necessarily recommend doing it, but it remains First Amendment protected speech. There is another Supreme Court case that arose out of the Vietnam era protests in which one of the anti-war protesters said, we are going to take back the streets later, and that went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, look, even if that was geared towards inciting unlawful activity, they said later, right? It wasn't imminent, and so it did not qualify as inciting imminently unlawful activity. So those are the first two prompts. You got to really intend to do it. It's got to be directed towards imminently unlawful activity, and it really has to be imminent. It has to be something that would happen right then. And then the third prong is that it's got to actually be likely to incite or produce unlawful activity. So, this is going to be context specific. And I would say, frankly, that if this takes place at a rally or something like that, it's more likely that it would be found to incite or produce, likely to incite or produce unlawful activity. But if, for example, somebody is just yelling on the street corner or something like that, it's very unlikely that that's actually going to cause other people that hear that speech to have a response where they would engage in unlawful activity. So that third part is it has to actually be likely, just from a sort of reasonable person standard, that unlawful activity would result. So that is a high bar. And what it means is, a lot of the stuff that could potentially be punished remains First Amendment protected speech. It is a very, very high bar to prove that something is actually inciting imminently unlawful activity. Third sort of prompt that I was asked to address sort of takes a different tack. and deals with the Hawley resolution, which was, I think, alluded to in the introduction. This, of course, was a resolution passed by the U.S. Senate on October 27th, in which the U.S. Senate, and I'm quoting here, denounced, quote, the rhetoric of anti-Israel, pro-Hamas student groups as anti-Semitic, repugnant, and morally contemptible. And the resolution further named and quoted student groups at 6 universities for engaging in sort of what the Senate apparently saw as repugnant and morally contemptible statements or protests. And the question I was asked was, does that resolution qualify as a suppression of speech, given that speech applies, the First Amendment applies to the government? And this was the United States Senate that issued that resolution. And the short answer to that question is no. That resolution does not violate the First Amendment. The First Amendment does apply to governmental action. It applies to governmental abridgment of speech. But the governmental leaders, the president, the Senate, whoever, are seen as having their own free speech rights, seen as being able to articulate whatever message they want, even if it's in response to speech that is being exercised by residents, by citizens, and even if it denounces that speech. So the fact that the Senate passed that resolution, though many may disagree with that, it doesn't qualify as a constitutional violation, because that's something that's seen as political leaders' free speech themselves, and it's treated just the same as if the Senate or the president denounced white supremacist statements, or, for example, we have a ex-president that regularly denounces statements by anybody that, for example, believes that he in fact lost the election in 2020. All of that is protected First Amendment speech. It does not qualify as a First Amendment violation when the government engages in speech, however much we may disagree with it. It only crosses a line if there's some punishment, some prohibition on other people's, on citizens' rights to engage in free speech. The final question that was asked to address is what advice do you have for students on safeguarding their free speech and protest rights while considering their future employment prospects? And I've got to be honest, I really thought a lot about this question before this panel, because the truth of the matter is, and I just want to be honest here, there is no legal restriction on employers from penalizing somebody for exercising their First Amendment rights, as long as those employers are in the private sector. Like I said, First Amendment only applies to the government, and a future employer can decide that they don't like something that you said, that they disagree with it, and it does not violate the First Amendment for them to deny somebody employment or take adverse employment action against a person for something they said in the past, for exercising their First Amendment rights. So there's not really a legal answer to this question. The law just doesn't prevent future employers from taking adverse action. And I know that this is a tremendously scary time for a lot of students in particular, and student activists. As was mentioned, we've seen doxing, we've seen pressure on universities and on future employment prospects on with respect to students who are advocating for what they stand for, advocating for what they believe in. So my best advice is really this. Look, the events in recent months have sparked, in a lot of circumstances, what are truly anti-Semitic and Islamophobic statements and sentiments that, frankly, I think have no business being in public discourse, but are protected by the First Amendment. And by the same token, it has also sparked what, at least in my view, are really frivolous accusations of, for example, anti-Semitism against students, activists who are simply advocating for what they believe in. And I say this as a Jewish person. Criticizing the Israeli government is not anti-Semitic. It's just not. And it's unfortunate that some of the rhetoric has been taken so far as to suggest that any criticism of the Israeli government necessarily constitutes anti-Semitism. That said, you can't force a future employer to believe that. Again, there's no legal protections for people as it relates to private employers, as it relates to private actors with respect to free speech rights. So the best advice I'd give is this. If you're an activist, if you're a student who wants to stand up, who wants to express your voice, who cares deeply about this or any other issue and believes strongly in raising your voice, in advocating, in engaging in free speech, I think you should do that. And I also think that, if you're concerned about future employment prospects, just think carefully about, whether, 5 years down the road, 2 years down the road, whenever somebody might ask you about what you said, if you feel comfortable standing behind it and saying, yes, I believe that. This is what I firmly believe. I continue to believe that. And here is why. Or even if maybe your mind changes, saying, I believe that at the time and I was comfortable saying it, and here is why. If you can stand up for what you believed in, and you can explain that to anybody that might question it, there may be some employers out there that won't hire you, but, quite candidly, that's an employer you may not have wanted to work for anyway. And if you can explain it, if you can justify it, if it's something that you're proud to stand behind, each word you said, at the end of the day, I do think that most people will respect that. Most employers will respect that. There's always going to be some sort of a trade-off and some sort of risk when you're advocating for a position, when you're advocating for what you believe in. Can't force everybody to agree with you. But we have this proud tradition of advocacy at the University of Michigan and in this county. I do hope it continues. I hope people continue to feel comfortable standing for what they believe in. And, if at the end of the day, you're proud to stand behind it, let the chips fall where they may, because, the worst thing would be if folks that are intent on suppressing speech through their actions, through doxing, through, frankly, bullying of university students were able to silence them. So that is the best advice I have. I realize it is not legal advice, but it's just how I would approach it as a student activist, which, I once was. And with that, I think that's just about exactly 15 minutes. So I'll turn it over to the next speaker and look forward to the question and answer.
Thank you, Ellie. Before I begin, I would like to start with a reminder that today, November 14th, 2023, marks day 38 of the ongoing bombardment, humanitarian crisis, collective punishment, and genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank by the State of Israel, resulting in the death of over 10,000 Palestinian men, women, and children. To acknowledge my sincere thanks to all who have played a role in allowing me to be here this afternoon, I would like to begin with a quote. "We are but dwarfs sitting on the shoulders of giants, because they raise us up, and by their great stature add to ours." With that, I would like to thank the University of Michigan Global Islamic Studies Center, its director, Dr. Aliyah Khan, and its associate director and fellow Palestinian American, Dr. Murad Idris, for giving me the opportunity to speak at such an important and timely event. I would also like to thank the Arab American Civil Rights League and the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee for giving me the opportunity to work closely with them in this endeavor. Last but not least, I would like to thank my law firm, H&H Law Group, and its co-founding partners, Sujud Hamadi and Mustafa Hawili, for supporting me every step of the way as I assisted with this important work. In the way of background, I have been working with the previously mentioned organizations in various efforts to bring back home Palestinian Americans stuck in Gaza and the West Bank due to the ongoing humanitarian crisis. I was part of an initial group of attorneys who received the call to action after statements made by the White House and other government agencies offered little hope for the safe return of Palestinian Americans. It was in response to these statements that the ACRL and ADC established a national hotline for individuals with Palestinian American friends or family members stranded in Gaza or the West Bank. The ACRL conducted intake interviews with each plaintiff, collecting vital information, including their geographical ties in the United States. To date, we have identified 58 plaintiffs, including entire families, elderly individuals, nursing babies, and individuals with chronic illnesses from various states across the country. The first lawsuit was filed by the ACRL here in the Eastern District of Michigan for the El Arashi family, a husband and wife stranded in Gaza. After weeks of relentless advocacy and status conferences with the judge, they safely returned to Michigan late last week, greeted by their children, grandchildren, and the ACRL. The lawsuit filed in the Eastern District of Michigan became the model pleading used across the country and included the relevant case law. We shared them with the attorneys and gave them the ability to edit them accordingly based on their respective clients' needs. The goal of the lawsuits was to apply pressure on the government to actually try to get Palestinian Americans out instead of leaving them stranded and waiting for them to die. We also wanted to increase media attention and amplify the voices of our plaintiffs in an effort to shed a light on the plight of our fellow Americans stuck in Gaza and the West Bank, and the government's failure to make efforts to save them. The legal basis of the lawsuits that have been filed across the country are a constitutional law claim under Section 1983 for equal protection and a request for entry of an order by the U.S. Secretary of State for administrative non-combative evacuation of U.S. citizens. In the most basic sense, an equal protection claim is filed when there is clear disparate treatment of individuals based on a protected class. In this case, that protected class would be ethnic and religious background. Our plaintiffs were all Palestinian American, and many were also Muslim American. As the lawsuit alleges, our clients are similarly situated to other U.S. citizens, meaning Israeli Americans, that have received evacuation services from the very same war zone in which they now find themselves trapped and with no means of escape. For weeks, Palestinian Americans were denied entry to Egypt despite the fact that they were told to travel south by the State Department. Further, the request for entry of an order by the U.S. Secretary of State for non-combative evacuation was similarly based on the disparate treatment mentioned by the White House and other government officials. The introduction to the brief in support for this emergency motion states, each of the defendants in this case has clearly stated to the American public that Israeli Jewish lives are worth saving, while failing to take sufficient action to protect those of desperately imperiled Palestinian Americans. Specifically, in joint press conferences in Israel, each defendant, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, stated unequivocally their intention to rescue Israeli Jewish Americans and not Palestinian Muslim Americans. Out of the 58 plaintiffs, only 4 were located in Michigan. This is when the real work began to find attorneys willing to file the lawsuits pro bono and also willing to sue the U.S. government on behalf of the 54 other plaintiffs that we had. This task showed me the true power of networking. My colleague Sajud Hamadi and I were tasked with finding attorneys, and we put our extensive network into action to find attorneys from across the country to assist their fellow Americans stuck in Gaza and the West Bank. Through these efforts, we, along with some of the other attorneys, including Amy, who's also on this call, were able to connect plaintiffs with attorneys licensed in multiple federal districts in Iowa, California, Texas, Missouri, New Jersey, Illinois, and Arkansas. Multiple lawsuits have been filed in hopes that they will intensify the U.S. government's repatriation efforts for the American citizens stuck in Gaza and the West Bank. Of the total 58 plaintiffs that we have, 5 of them are under the age of 2, including 2 that are less than a year old. We also have 6 plaintiffs that are older than the state of Israel, being born on or before 1948. The rest of the ages vary, comprising of teenagers, early adults, and elderly individuals. I am thankful to report that through the continuous efforts of all the attorneys we have been working with, along with continued advocacy by the ACRL to Congress and local officials for our identified plaintiffs, roughly 35 of them have been able to cross over into Egypt, and many of them are already back stateside. Two issues our plaintiffs faced were, one, being placed on the list to cross into Egypt, but then upon arrival to the Rafah border crossing, not being able to. And two, the fact that all members of the same immediate family were not listed together, but rather a husband and not his wife was listed, or children but not their mother were listed, making these already unimaginable times even more unimaginable. They were forced to make a life-altering decision. Do I stay until we are all on the list, or do I let them cross without me into safety? The fact that grandparents, parents, spouses, or children even have to make these decisions is inconceivable. Just to backtrack a little bit, when I say list, I mean there is a published list that has been going around of approved individuals posted on the Facebook page of the State of Palestine General Authority for Crossings and Borders through a Google Drive link, updated daily in tandem with emails from the State Department sent to U.S. citizens informing them that they would be on the list. Many of us may be wondering, but what about the people without a country to leave to, meaning non-U.S. citizens or foreign passport holders? I will caveat by saying this is not my area of expertise, but I have seen communications between the attorneys on our team regarding humanitarian visas for non-U.S. citizens or foreign passport holders. This would grant you temporary protective status to remain in a different country to assist individuals in need of shelter or aid from disasters, oppression, emergency medical issues, and other urgent circumstances. With all that being said, I will focus on my own experience as a Palestinian American growing up and how I have seen a shift in today's society. As I already mentioned, I am a Palestinian American born and raised here in Ann Arbor. I am also an alum of UMich and graduated in 2016. Growing up, I didn't have much experience or issues as a Palestinian. All the way through high school, I was able to make friends and engage with people of different backgrounds without issue. Frankly, it wasn't until I stepped foot on the UMich campus that I realized my identity as a Palestinian was extremely politicized, and my right to exist was even something people questioned. My U of M experience was also during the height of the BDS movement on campus. I just want to give a big shout out to SAFE, Students Allied for Freedom and Equality. I took multiple classes on the Middle East, but one that sticks with me to this day is the intergroup relations class that I took on the Arab-Israeli conflict, where one student made a comment that the IDF is the most humane army in the world because they drop leaflets before they bomb them. But in general, I do believe we have definitely seen a shift in public perception as it relates to Palestine and Israel, but we still have work to do. The people's voices are being silenced by the inaction of elected officials and their seeming lack of interest in calling for an immediate ceasefire to put a halt to the innocent loss of life, despite protests by Palestinians and their allies. Sadly, overall, I think there has not been much change in the university setting, as I continue to witness students, professors, and administrators being silenced, and statements made on behalf of universities failing to acknowledge the plight of the Palestinian people and the loss of Palestinian life. On a national level, most of the government officials don't seem to care, but the people do, and the numbers continue to grow. But we keep seeing inaction by our government, and rather they keep funding the violence to preserve their investment. We have seen Florida Governor Rick DeSantis closing SJP chapters all across Florida. Columbia University recently closed their SJP chapter as well as the JVP chapter on campus. Misinformation continues to spread. I even saw a video on LinkedIn a fellow attorney posted, of a pro-Palestine protest severely misquoting the chant. We have seen and heard calls to level Gaza from Israeli officials using genocidal language. Over the last 2 days, there have been 2 fake videos shared by Israeli official accounts, one allegedly showing a doctor at a hospital in Gaza as Hamas breaks into steal natural gas and other supplies. The other is of the Hamas command center allegedly found below a children's hospital, with a Hamas roster on the wall. But upon further inspection, it's just the days of the week written in Arabic since October 7th. One of the most disheartening examples of this urge to silence pro-Palestinian voices is the fact that last week, U.S. Representative Rashida Tlaib, an attorney and the only Palestinian American member of Congress, was censured for her advocacy on Palestine. This just further shows the U.S. government's lack of interest in preserving and protecting Palestinian lives, despite their constituents strongly supporting an immediate ceasefire, which is evidenced by numerous protests and calls to Congress across the state, the country, and even the world. As we discuss advocacy efforts, I think it's important for me to highlight my own privilege in this space. As I mentioned, I am lucky to work at a law firm that supports me wholeheartedly and even works to assist me in my advocacy efforts, so I have no fear of repercussion. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same for many of my colleagues who have been reprimanded by the management at their firms for their support of Palestine, either publicly or on their personal social media accounts. I have been contacted by students at high schools who were suspended because of participating in a peaceful protest. We are also seeing reporters discuss these protests negatively, using charged terms, referring to them as pro-Hamas activists for using their voices to call for a ceasefire. I have also been contacted by college students who are scared about protesting on campus or want to know what their rights are for fear of being reprimanded or losing job opportunities. To bring it back to a personal experience, one of my good friends who is an attorney liked my post on LinkedIn, and the following day received a call from one of the managing partners at his firm asking him about liking the post, and then stating that some of the other partners at the firm felt uncomfortable and unsafe coming into the office because he liked the post. It shocked me, to say the least. Ultimately, though, I am thankful for the opportunity to have played a role in the safe return of some Palestinian Americans stuck in Gaza. And I'm filled with hope despite the lack of humanity I see from world leaders, because the people are standing up and speaking out, using their voice to show their support for the Palestinian cause. I hope and pray that we keep applying pressure and this genocide will come to an end before more innocent lives are lost. In closing, my ask to you is that we do better, we vet information, and we do our own research. We cannot take things at face value anymore. The situation is too dire. I thank you again, and I pass it on to Amy.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. As I was introduced, my name is Amy Doukoure. I'm the staff attorney for CAIR-Michigan. And for those of you who might not know what CAIR-Michigan is, that stands for Council on American-Islamic Relations-Michigan. We are a local chapter of the nation's largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization. And we have as our main mission to enhance the lives of Michigan's Muslims through education, mediation, media, and the law. Our work involves direct advocacy work, where we take in intakes or complaints from individuals who have experienced Islamophobia, hate crimes, school-related discrimination, or employment discrimination, and then we sometimes represent them and sometimes we refer them out. So I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see a little bit about the numbers that we're seeing here at CAIR-Michigan. Since October 7th, we've seen a 340+% increase in the amount of intakes that we're receiving at CAIR-Michigan, complaints about Islamophobia, employment discrimination, and school-related complaints. And this is important because I think a lot of times some people don't understand how things that are going on overseas really affect our daily lives here in Michigan. What we also know is that if you look at the numbers, the largest place that we're seeing people affected by what's taking place overseas is really when it comes to schools. And that includes K through 12 schools as well as colleges and universities. The most common complaint we're seeing at CAIR-Michigan since October 7th arises directly out of the exercise of an individual's First Amendment rights to free speech. Most primarily their speech on social media or during protests that are happening on college campuses and high school campuses around the state. These issues range from school discipline, where students are being suspended or asked to leave. We saw students in one school district in Oakland County engage in a very peaceful protest, and they were excluded from school under the school's threat assessment protocol to determine whether they were a threat to other students for simply engaging in a protest where they were calling for the liberation of the Palestinian people and calling for a ceasefire. We have also seen the weaponization of law enforcement on peaceful protesters on campuses around the state of Michigan, including Michigan State University. And we've seen a lot of doxing and harassment online, and we'll talk a little bit about doxing and harassment later. And we've also, as Fadel said, we've fielded calls about cases involving U.S. citizens who are trapped in Gaza with no way to return to the U.S., despite the fact that the U.S. has been evacuating citizens from Israel as well as other neighboring countries and has a long history of being able to repatriate U.S. citizens that are stranded overseas in conflict zones. We've also seen a rise in hate crimes, unfortunately, against Muslim Americans in Michigan, including on college campuses. Sometimes those crimes are nonviolent and they involve stalking and harassing type behavior, generally by men, to very visibly Muslim women reading, women wearing hijab. And sometimes when these incidences are reported to the police, they're not really taken that seriously. And despite being stalked and harassed, they've been told that those individuals are engaging in quote unquote free speech. But when your speech is directed at an individual in a way that's intended to be threatening or harassing, that is not included in your free speech protections. What we're seeing in Michigan is not dissimilar to what we're seeing around the country. We have group calls once a week with our national office and all of our other chapters. And what you're seeing here with regards to the FBI related interactions, school discipline, and employment related problems, Islamophobia, and the rise in hate crimes is very systematically what we're seeing across the board, with doxing being the most problematic and prevalent problem that we're having. And when we talk about doxing, one of the things that people have to understand for doxing is the release of your personal identifying information with an effort and an intent to harass you and to call others to harass you. And that's exactly what happens. They're releasing people's home address, their cell phone number, their email address, their place of employment. And it has resulted in harassment, not just online, but via telephone and other medium forms, to the point where people have had to get personal protection orders just to engage in their safety. So doxing, when we think most primarily about Canary Mission, but doxing takes many other forms other than Canary Mission. So what are some of the things that we're seeing specifically on school grounds? What we've seen now is not uncommon, and it's not unrelated to what we've seen in the past. Anytime there is any conflict involving Muslims, we see a significant rise in students on college campuses, high school campuses, and even K-8 classes facing Islamophobia, implicit bias, and discrimination. Since October 7th, there have been educators as young as sixth grade who are giving one-sided versions of events, claiming that things are happening and being orchestrated by Hamas, which are practicing Muslims. And when used the loaded terms like practicing Muslims, when you're speaking to a group of students, teachers are seen as an authority figure in the classroom. They're seen as the person with the knowledge. And what it does is it has the effect of causing Muslim students to be defensive about their religion. It causes them to be subjugated and suspect by their peers. And as Muslims, we don't generally try to determine who's a practicing Muslim and who's not. So for somebody else to do it in a way that paints an entire religion as inherently violent is problematic and is bias related and causes students to feel unsafe. We have seen Arab and Muslim students singled out by middle school teachers for making comments that they don't agree with a one-sided view. And then we've actually saw a middle school teacher who made a comment about Gaza belonging to Israel, and that they have the right to take whatever action that is necessary to secure their interest in Gaza. And when a student said, I don't agree with that, a sixth grade student said, I don't agree with that, the teacher then took a poll of all of the other students and said, who agrees with me and who agrees with her, singling out that student for unfair, ridicule and to defend herself in front of her students. That same teacher then said, it doesn't really matter what any of you guys think anyways, this is my opinion. And your opinions don't matter because this is what the U.S. government says, thereby dismissing, the feelings and the opinions of other people in an academic setting where we should be encouraging discourse. We have actually seen high school students being taunted by fellow students wearing IDF sweatshirts at school. they're wearing IDF sweatshirts, and if you know anything about the relationship between the IDF and Arabs and Palestinians specifically, it's a very tenuous relationship, to say the least, and it's fraught with insecurity, with hardship and pain. And a student's wearing an IDF sweatshirt and he's pointing to it, he's laughing at his fellow Muslim students, and when the students are complaining, we don't feel safe, this doesn't make us feel welcome, we don't appreciate it, they're told, well, this is free speech, he's allowed to wear this t-shirt in class, and there's nothing really you can do with it. But this, unfortunately, is the same school that attempted to suspend students and refused to allow them back in class because they wouldn't answer questions about how their Jewish classmates felt when they held a peaceful protest outside in favor of Palestinian liberation and were chanting things like "Free Palestine" and "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which the school dubbed as a genocidal call against the Jewish individuals instead of a call for liberation of Palestinians, which is what we all know that it really is. So and this is sort of systematic of what we see, and not just in times of conflict like we are in now, but we have experienced at CAIR-Michigan, we have experienced where Muslim students and other students of color are treated differently. Their thoughts and their ideas are considered to be inherently dangerous and inherently criminal, and they're not generally seen as a victim, and they're punished more harshly for engaging in the same types of conduct that their non-Muslim peers are engaging in. So on the one hand, you have students saying we don't feel safe because this person's wearing a shirt, and we don't feel safe, and because these students are saying "Free Palestine," and you see the school responding in two different ways. You see one way they're responding as a threat assessment, and you see the other way where they're brushing it off and saying, kind of just get over it and get some thicker skin. And this is systematic of what we're seeing. And I know that, Counselor Ellie had talked about free speech on campuses. And there's only one different caveat between the free speech you have on campuses of community colleges and public universities and the high school. And that's in high school, you have all of your free speech rights, but you don't have the right to disrupt the learning environment for other students. That's the only difference that you have. So the schools are justifying their actions and their treatment of the Palestinian, pro-Palestinian students by saying, this is causing a disruption to our learning environment because we find your speech inherently problematic, which in our opinion is just another form of viewpoint or discrimination that Brother Ellie spoke about earlier. We also saw a student, a substitute teacher in a study hall going on a 30-minute diatribe about how Arabs are taught to hate Jewish people. And that's in their culture. So they're kind of getting what's coming to them. And then we saw that school do nothing about that. So in addition to the discipline that we're seeing in schools, we're seeing, peer-on-peer bullying in schools, and we're seeing teacher on student bullying in schools, and leaving students to have to sort of defend themselves, defend their religion, defend their national origin, and defend their culture, and sometimes defend their friends, quite frankly. On college campuses, things look a little bit different, right? So college campuses are intended to be places of like higher learning, places of more open dialogue. But what we've seen on college campuses really relates to written statements of administrators that are either one-sided or patently Islamophobic, right? We've seen U of M's president has released 3 statements. Each one of them is a little bit more problematic than the other. MSU, same thing. Wayne State, we've seen some other things with regards to statements that have been put out. So they're making these one-sided comments and then just completely ignoring the concerns of the other side and the feelings and the emotions that are involved with the people who are really engaged in liberating Palestine or seeing a ceasefire in the end to the humanitarian crisis that's going on over there. Another thing that we're seeing is on college campuses, it's really peer on peer sort of hostilities, I would say. We've seen, I know on U of M campus, there was some protesters that followed some Muslim women around and were shouting at them, calling them terrorists. We've seen administrators and faculty members of various universities taking down pro-Palestinian literature that has been placed around the campus, despite the fact that it was placed in a way that complies with the campus policies. We've seen at Wayne State University, we saw a group of Muslim students who they have a rock. I think a lot of schools have a rock, and they painted it with a Palestinian flag. And less than a day later, and in violation of the student code of conduct, it was painted over with an Israeli flag. And when the administration told those students to, just go paint it back over, replace your support, we stand beside you, the students that were painting it over were actually attacked, physically attacked by people who were upset that they were removing the Palestinian flag, and it resulted in a physical altercation. So tensions are very high on campus, and we're seeing a lot of peer-on-peer, hostilities. And we're seeing some of that rhetoric, we believe, and some of those hostilities are coming directly from the one-sided rhetoric and the one-sided statements that are coming out. It's sort of what we saw in Chicago with the murder of Wadia, when there's just this overwhelming set of information coming out that's so one-sided and paints such a negative picture of one specific group of individuals, that it is creating hostilities instead of creating conversations, which is why we've cautioned, campuses in public school districts to put out statements that are more balanced and more level-headed, and kind of really speak to the complexities of the issues that are going on overseas. And one of the biggest things that we're seeing on college campuses that people are really, really scared about is bullying and online harassment, and utilizing the identification of people who are engaging in public protests or protests on social media to create a doxing situation, which then we've seen it result in loss of job opportunity, loss of grad school opportunity, and really, really online harassment of students at colleges and universities. So these are all some of the things that are coming, and it's really the overwhelming majority of the complaints that we're getting. I think it's something, if I go back to the last slide, it's around 36% of all of the complaints that we're receiving since October 7th are related to things that are going on college campuses, and the vast majority of those in public school campuses, colleges and public schools, and the vast majority of those complaints are coming from college campuses. I want to speak a little bit to employment-related incidences, and I want to thank, Counselor Ellie for, giving us hope in what's going on with regards to our job prospects, because I know a lot of students are really, really scared, and what he said is absolutely correct. There's very little that anybody can do with a private employer who decides that they don't like a stance that you've taken publicly or politically, and decides that they no longer want to move ahead with the job offer, or they want to terminate you. So far, what we've seen coming since October 7th, and even more recently in Michigan, as far as employment-related concerns, they're arising from people primarily in the medical field, doctors and nurses, those in the healthcare industry, and those concerns range from having their employers tagged on their social media posts by a commenter who is then asking for the employer to discipline or fire somebody for saying something as simple as Free Palestine. Just a Free Palestine post on LinkedIn led to Henry Ford Health Systems being tagged in a bunch of different doctors' social media accounts asking for direct action, direct discipline, and termination, which causes fear in our medical professionals, quite frankly, who are here serving the community in whatever capacity that they're practicing. And this really looks like there's a concerted and systematic effort to identify, report, and demand action for these social media posts that appear to be pro-Palestinian. And I say that because the language that they're using is the same, the tactics that they're using the same, the way that they're going about it is the same, and they're very antagonistic, and they're oftentimes looking for a confrontation, not just from the original poster, but also from the employer itself. So far, we haven't really seen too many people who are already employed and are part of their career that have went to a protest and have been identified at a public protest and then had a loss of job or discipline over that. More than likely, employers are utilizing social media to discipline. And the way that they do that is through the use of their social media policies. Most big corporations have a specific social media policy that they're utilizing. And if you violate the social media policy, and they will terminate you for that, because your speech is then imputed on them as their own speech. However, there are remedies for this, because if you are already employed and they're applying their social media policy in a way that treats you differently than somebody else who has a different viewpoint on the same topic, or they're unfairly applying and arbitrarily applying their social media policy, there are legal actions that you may be able to take, but that's only once you're employed, and only if you can identify, some similarly situated comparators where they have not treated them exactly the same. We also know that the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, has a 3-point pledge that they are in fact getting many larger employees to sign. And once these pledges are signed, we know that they're going after and looking at employees' social media profiles. And this has been very prolific in the medical field, the healthcare field in Michigan, and they're bragging about getting doctors terminated, including cancer doctors, terminated from their employment because of the pledge that was signed by these medical groups, and it curtails the speech of the employee when employers sign these pledges. And it kind of leads to the employer abdicating their hiring and disciplinary powers to the third party group, the ADL. And it could eventually lead to the ADL being liable or exposed to litigation for interference with business practices. And that's something that we are actually looking at. And I know a lot of other law firms are looking at. I just want to talk about 2 other topics: law enforcement and travel related incidents. I'm not really sure how many of you know, but Muslims are literally the largely surveilled population of individuals in the United States. We are more heavily surveilled right now than any other faith group, community, ethnic community of national origin. Muslims are 10 times more likely to be surveilled by the federal government, by local law enforcement, and you're 10 plus times more likely to be stopped while re-entering the United States from an overseas trip than any other group in the United States right now. So some of the things that we're seeing with regards to how this plays out since October 7th with law enforcement, as I stated before, we're seeing college campuses, security departments, or Department of Public Works, or in the case of Wayne State, they have their own police department, the systematic ignoring of concerns of Arab and Muslim students when it comes to complaining about hate crimes and bias on campus. We saw the weaponization at Michigan State specifically of the public safety officers against Muslims who were pro-Palestinians, taking the shape of calling the campus police and having campus police escort one specific student around campus all day while he wore an IDF hat, because he claimed he didn't feel safe on campus while wearing that hat, despite the fact that nobody had said anything to him, nobody had encountered him. He got the police involved before he had even approached campus, and he went to a meeting where they were discussing resolutions related to boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS, as we like to call it, against Israel. And he showed up at that meeting with a campus safety officer, quote unquote, for his own security. So we've seen the weaponization of public safety officers on campus against peaceful protesting Muslims who are engaging in one of the most peaceful forms of protest that you can, withdrawing your money from something that you don't believe in. I don't think that there's any more peaceful form of protest than that. So we've seen that. And we've seen the FBI itself continues to put out these bulletins where they are claiming that they have a concern against the increased rise in hate crimes against Jewish individuals, despite there being no specific statistics that is taking place. And it says so right in these bulletins. And these bulletins also say that there is no specific information that they have, that there is any planned event or any risk to, like, actual information about any specific risk to any community. And this has really created a cloud of suspicion around the Muslims and how they are viewed in the eyes of local law enforcement. And this is really has resulted in the closing of public schools in the state of Michigan. We saw elementary schools in Oakland County closing after the FBI issued one of these alerts, despite the fact that there was no ongoing threat, no legitimate threat. But the school sent out a letter stating, we believe that Jewish students are at risk because of this memo, and we're closing the school despite the fact that we have no information that a risk is happening. And this causes division and divisiveness in the community, right? It pits the Muslim families in a light against the Jewish families in a light where the Muslim families they feel ostracized. They feel like they're being painted as inherently violent. Now, I know if we just juxtapose that with the shooting of a home of a family with a BB gun, what turned out to be a BB gun. They didn't know it was a BB gun when it first happened. Somebody shot into the home through the window of a Muslim family, 3 shots in East Lansing. Right after these incidents happened, right after the FBI put out these memos, and what we saw in those cases was the East Lansing Police Department basically saying, this is not a concern. It's just a BB gun. Let's and not really treat it very seriously, despite the fact that no other homes on the block were shot up, and that was the only home of the only visibly Muslim in that neighborhood when that happened. So we see this overzealousness when it comes to one group, but we see the under concern for other groups that are also being targeted. And one of the most concerning things that we've seen at CAIR-Michigan when it comes to law enforcement is we have seen the FBI have visited Palestinian American homes, citizens of America, but national origin of Palestine, even if they've never been there, they didn't grow up there, asking them about their political beliefs overseas. The FBI has no business, they have no right, and they have no jurisdiction over your thoughts, your political beliefs about what's going on in the United States, let alone overseas. We have seen, we saw the detention of a Palestinian national who is under deportation orders in the state of Michigan. He was taken into custody, held for 5 days without being given counsel, and was interrogated each day by the FBI prior to his counsel being able to visit him while he was in custody. And one of the more disturbing things that we've also seen at CAIR-Michigan is the fact that people are re-entering the United States and they're being held and detained at the border and being questioned about Palestinian American citizens who living in Michigan. So they're being stopped at the border and they're being asked by CBP, and sometimes the FBI is being called to the border, and they're being asked, hey, what do you know about this person who's Palestinian, who we found your phone number next to his, or you follow him on social media, or what's going on with what he's doing? How do you feel about him? What do you know about him? Border interrogations are never appropriate. There's supposed to be an inspection at the border. You have the right to enter. If you're a U.S. citizen, you have an unmitigated right to enter the United States without being questioned about anything other than your travel, your citizenship, and what and how much money you're bringing back with you into the United States. Other than that, it turns into an unconstitutional in-custody interrogation where they deny you the right to counsel. And to utilize that process, that inspection process, to hold and interrogate U.S. citizens about other U.S. citizens because of political beliefs, because of prior national origins, is really just abhorrent, and really goes against the fundamental constitutional principles that are from the 4th Amendment all the way down to the 10th Amendment of the United States. So I know that wasn't very brief, but just briefly, that's kind of what we're seeing at CAIR-Michigan. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I think that at this time, they're going to open it up for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Amy, thank you, Fadel, and thank you, Ellie, for taking the time to be with us and for your enlightening and inspiring comments. The floor is now open, so please do submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. As Dr. Khan said right in the beginning, when we put this event together, it really was with students in mind. So please do ask your questions. And we actually have a few. I'm going to have this first one. So the question reads, I am glad that two of the speakers have experience teaching in both public and private schools. Are the same laws governing free speech in public universities, do they apply to public schools? For example, putting up posters or handling flyers, which, as we know, has been a source of controversy. And what about private schools? What exceptions do they have?
So I guess I'll start. I think Amy covered a lot of this. I think this question came in before she talked, but generally, yes, public schools are bound by the First Amendment. They are an arm of government. The one thing is that a school can place restrictions on speech that are geared towards prohibiting a disruption of learning. So a disruption of teaching, disruption of learning. Now, again, the relevant thing is going to be content based restrictions on speech. So if you imagine, for example, a billboard at a school where it's generally accepted, you can put up whatever, sort of flyers you want. It's sort of the school has designated that as a billboard where, students can freely express their opinions. The school can't single out a certain type of content and say you can't put that up on this particular bulletin board or what have you. Again, content-based restrictions are really where you run afoul of the First Amendment. Now, if the bulletin board is something that is expressly meant for teachers to be able to display student work or whatever, right, then you can't put anything over that, right? So that's not going to be a content-based restriction on speech. It's just a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction, which is okay under the First Amendment. With respect to handing out flyers, you can hand out flyers. It just cannot disrupt the school learning environment. So if you're a public school student, make sure you are taking advantage of, for example, passing time or, handing them out outside the school. I think a school could reasonably preclude somebody from, walking in the middle of class and handing out flyers there, because that could be disruptive to learning. With respect to private schools, they're not bound by they're not bound by the First Amendment. There can sometimes be funding restrictions that the government places on private schools, which require them to abide by, certain protections that are afforded by the First Amendment. That's something the government can do as a condition of giving funding to private schools. And then also in some states, I know in California, private universities at least are subject to state laws, which require them to respect free speech rights. But, if you're talking about just like the First Amendment as a whole, they don't it does not apply to private entities. So there would have to be a different hook, either the government imposing funding restrictions or a state law.
Great, thank you. We have a question here for a student who is visibly Muslim or who is at a Palestinian protest. What should they do if someone gets right in their face, blocks their path, and or is yelling at them that they're a terrorist or using other racialized terms? Does this behavior violate the law, or does it violate university policy? But it seems the question here is who should they go to and what should they do? What would your advice be to that student, maybe right in that moment and maybe the day after as well?
I would so we have a best practices for protesting pamphlet that we put out at CAIR-Michigan, and I think the best thing to do when you're being engaged with somebody who's not calm is to remain calm, right? We're not going to engage with that. We're going to remain calm. Whether it breaks the law or not is a broader question, because it really depends on the actual content, the conduct of the other person, how egregious it is, what they're doing. But if you're in a protest, one of the things that you're not allowed to do is block somebody else's path. So there are things to do. If that does happen to you, remain calm, try to de-escalate the situation, and try to leave that immediate situation to a place that's more safe for yourself. And then I would follow up with Department of Public Safety on campus as necessary, or if you're at a public protest, the police department as well. I also say it's important, if you're out at protests, to videotape things that are happening like this, and that's just another layer of protection for yourself. If there's ever a dispute about what happened during some form of altercation, if there's a videotape for it, it's always going to be best evidence, quite frankly.
I would echo that, and I'll just add on to that. If you are threatened, if somebody threatens physical harm, please do report that to law enforcement. I know here in Washtenaw County, at least, law enforcement is great and is very attuned to what's going on. A threat of physical harm is something that all of us and our law enforcement partners will take seriously. Remember, I mentioned earlier that true threats are not protected by the First Amendment, and indeed there are several laws which criminalize them, and nobody should feel unsafe, should be threatened because of their attendance at a protest, or certainly not because of who they are. So please do report that to law enforcement. Obviously, from our office's perspective, we have to judge cases based on the evidence that comes in. But if there is evidence sufficient to prove up a case beyond a reasonable doubt, we will absolutely prosecute threat-related cases. So please do report that to law enforcement.
Great. Thank you both. We have a related question, I think, and it's if it's the same one or two students who are targeting Muslim students. We talked about this a little bit, following them, yelling at them, calling them terrorists. Does the fact that it's the same person matter for the nature of the action, or for how to think about the standard? So again, here the question is, what advice do you have for the student in that case? And we've heard stay calm as one sort of key piece of this. Is there something else that you would want to add to students in this situation?
I'll just reemphasize what I just said. From a legal standard, it does make sense that it does make a difference that it's the same person, because that could give rise to potentially stalking charges if it's a repeated course of conduct. So certainly, if somebody's following you around, if somebody's repeatedly threatening you, again, contact law enforcement. Let law enforcement and our office sort things out in terms of whether it's something that's chargeable and the appropriate charge. But from a legal perspective, from a criminal law perspective, repeated course of conduct by a particular individual can give rise to stalking charges as well.
If I just want to plus one what Ali said, but also say that in Michigan, it only requires 2 unwanted contacts to get a PPO. So if somebody engages you twice in 2 unwanted contacts, and you know the person and you can identify the person, then you can get a personal protection order against that person. And that includes for online harassment, not just in person.
Excellent. Thank you. And this actually dovetails nicely with our next question, which is, what's the best way to deal with online bullying and harassment when someone is trying to share the truth about what is happening in Gaza and in the West Bank? So maybe here we can ask the question both from the perspective of the law, but also from the perspective of activism as well.
So for online, if you're engaging in online activity, it's very, very important to protect yourself and your personal information online. Especially if you are engaging in pro-Palestinian work, education efforts, you should take steps to ensure that your private identifying information is not linked to your social media. That will cut down on the possibility of getting doxxed, right? So your phone number should not be linked to your TikTok account or your Instagram account or whatever other account that you might be using. So protect your private information online is probably your best defense. Also, don't engage Black people who are being, I don't know if the kids still, they'll call them trolls, but if they still like block the trolls, right? And if somebody is actually harassing you, threatening you, publish your information, making phone calls to you based on information they found online, contact law enforcement. I know there are a lot of law enforcement agencies that have taken that very seriously, including the city of Dearborn, where they have actually prosecuted. I know the FBI is involved in looking at cases against where Muslims were being harassed online, and it turned into harassment on phone and in person. So contact law enforcement, take steps to protect your identity, and make sure that you're blocking people who are harassing you, is what I would say.
I will just add blocking, but also like screenshotting, keeping a record of everything, make sure you have receipts of everything, where you're able to pass them along to law enforcement before you block them, and just so, again, you have a record.
Great, thank you. Here we have a question for Mr. Savit. We've seen students at other universities around the country be arrested in relation to their activism. For example, the students at Brown University are arrested for trespassing. Is the county discussing what their action would be if there are arrests at the University of Michigan? Has that been part of the conversation?
Sure. So we ethically can't like prejudge any particular case that's going to come in front of us, and everything's going to depend on the facts, on the circumstances, and what's in the interest of justice. I will say we do try to respect and give wide berth to the right to nonviolent, peaceful political protest. But every case is different, and we sort of ethically have to take it as it comes in, based on the facts that are submitted to us and the evidence. And in large part, that's what I was hoping to convey today, just to allow people to know where the line is legally, what's protected by the First Amendment. Certainly would encourage people to stay on the protected side of things.
Thank you. And this question is for Fadel and Nabilsi. How did you find an employer that would support your Palestinian experience? Did you struggle with opportunities on campus and beyond due to speaking out about Palestine? And maybe we can add an addendum to that as well. What advice might you have for students in that situation today?
So I am very fortunate in the employer that I found, who supports my Palestine advocacy. She's just as, both of them actually are just as vocal as I am. I'm proud of my Palestinian identity, so it comes out on the table pretty early on. When I'm interviewing or talking with employers. My previous firm, they found out initially during my interview process as well. They hired me anyways. And that was a very prominent Jewish firm. Mostly Jewish individuals were in that firm. And so it's kind of just, there isn't really a good answer to this, I guess. You do your research, you see where your potential employer stands on the issue. It can limit the opportunities that you may have. But a lot of the time, I mean, especially for me in my career, I haven't been employed by anyone at the height of any of these issues. So I guess it's different in that sense because I'm not vocal about it all the time, or I don't necessarily have have a reason to be. I'm Palestinian. My identity is prevalent. It's there. It's a part of me. It's something that's discussed, but in terms of advocating for Palestine, it would be in moments like this where I think it would be more difficult for individuals to navigate that sort of workspace. But I would say do your research. And I think it was Ellie who said, honestly, if they don't support your pro-Palestine stuff, it's not a company you want to work for anyways. And I know it's a little bit more difficult. You'll have to put in a little bit more work to find a job or a place that you're happy or comfortable being at. But I think that would be the best advice is do your research, figure out where you want to be long-term and what your goals are. And also you can use places as stepping stones. You could stay there for just a little bit, gain the experience you need and move on. There's no shame in that.
Thank you, Fadel. Here's another question that I know a lot of people have been confronting. If I work for a public university health system, can my employer curtail or ask me to abstain from sending emails regarding the Palestinian cause to my immediate team and leadership?
And I'll defer to Ali to a little bit for this too, but if you work for a public university and a public health system that receives public funds, it's a double-edged sword, because sometimes your speech can be imputed as the government speech or as your employer's speech. So if you're doing it in your official function as your official job, you probably have less protections for what you can freely say. But it also cuts the other way, where if you're doing it in your private capacity and you're speaking about something that is quote unquote of public importance, I think is the actual term, then you are actually protected from being disciplined or terminated for your private speech on social media and protests. But while you're engaged in your actual duties, you are limited in what you can say, lest it be imputed onto the government or your employer.
Yeah. I'll echo that and just give one other caveat, which is the government as an employer is sort of in a different sphere than the government as like regulator, as lawmakers, and what have you. So what Amy said is absolutely right. To the extent it can be imputed to the employer, that's something that they can prohibit you from doing, certainly on company time and the like. The other thing to be aware of is even in the government employment context, there are situations in which the government can prohibit you from speaking out if it's something that could cast doubt on your ability to fairly and faithfully apply the standards that the government employer needs to apply from performing your basic functions. I'll just give an example, right? I am a government employer, right? I have assistant prosecuting attorneys and other staff that work for me. If you want to disagree with me on who to vote for in the next presidential election and post a spoiler alert to everybody here, it's not going to be Donald Trump, and you want to post a Trump 2020 thing on Facebook, like, okay, right? Can't fire somebody for that. If you say something that is expressly anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, racist, on social media, that to my mind significantly calls into question your ability as a lawyer or a victim advocate, or somebody working in the prosecutor's office, to faithfully discharge your duties, because how on earth could a victim who is a member of that class of people have the confidence that you are going to treat them fairly? So there could be adverse employment action there. And I just give that as an example. That's not an all-encompassing example, but I do want folks that work for the government to be aware of that nuance too. The government, when it's acting as an employer, does have some more power to discipline, to engage in adverse employment action based on somebody's speech that would otherwise be protected. And at the end of the day, it gets really nuanced and really complex. And frankly, I'm not an employment lawyer either, so I don't know all the nuances. don't guess on this, right? If you are in this situation, I'd encourage you to contact somebody with expertise, an employment lawyer, CAIR, ACLU, somebody that can give you a good answer as to the precise parameters with your job classification, so you're not potentially facing adverse employment action down the line.
Great, thank you. We have a question here about student arrests. In the situation of escalation that may lead to student arrests, when is it a situation that goes beyond the jurisdiction of the university? So essentially, when does something fall under county prosecution? What might happen to a student after they're arrested?
So generally speaking, if there is an arrest, then a case is referred to us. A potential criminal case is referred to the prosecutor's office, and we make a determination based on the evidence that's submitted whether we are going to move forward with criminal charges. The University of Michigan has a police force. It has its own police force. I will say that I've been involved in many events and protests on U of M's campus, and they are very respectful of First Amendment rights, but they are a fully empowered police force there. So it's not like in a typical situation, something happens on campus and they would call in the Washtenaw County sheriffs to call in, Ann Arbor police. There can sometimes be situations where that occurs, where you need, mutual aid or something like that. But generally speaking, there's going to be a police agency with jurisdiction. And then if it's a potential violation of state law, that goes over to the county prosecutor's office. If it's a violation of a city ordinance, it would go to the Ann Arbor City Attorney's office. If it's a federal crime, a potential violation of a federal law, then it would go to the U.S. Attorney's office. But generally speaking, that's how things work. Requests for charges are funneled up to the relevant prosecuting authority, who will then look at the evidence and make a determination as to whether to charge.
All right, great. And here we have a question specifically about professors, about faculty. Professors who signed a petition asking President Ono to pay equal attention to the plight and hurt of Palestinian and Muslim students have been accused of anti-Semitism because they called out historical actions on the part of Israel. So how do we think about that in relation to both the freedom of expression for the faculty, and also in terms of that accusation of being anti-Semitic?
I think this kind of goes back to like public university, public employers, public import. I think that's a very fact-based, nuanced question, and I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to that. And it probably has a lot to do with policies that are of the university, whether they're being applied fairly, and whether or not it meets the other employment criteria, because public university professors, adjunct professors, and tenure professors have the right to engage in free speech of matters of public import. Whether something is anti-Semitic or not sometimes is based on who the listener is, right? How we talk about impact versus intent, quite frankly. So that's something that probably requires a deeper delve into a lot of different factors before a concrete answer can be given, in my opinion.
Thank you. Here we have an earlier question. Does the First Amendment protections mentioned regarding employers also apply to the U.S. Army or defense contractors as part of the government, or is that also private sector? This is a question from someone who works for the Department of Defense and is unsure where that leaves them in relation to their activism.
Yeah, I think largely answered that with respect to the previous question. It's nuanced and complicated. It can, and please contact somebody with expertise in it, with who can talk about your specific job classification, your duties, and what rights you might have there.
Great. Here we have the question about anti-Semitism and how it's defined legally, in particular. So, what is it legally? Who can define it in relation to the law? And our attendee says that this line is becoming blurred at the moment, which is something that some of you have referenced. So, if you'd like to react to this particular question.
This is an interesting question. There is no legal definition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is defined based on the listener, right? How you feel about something is kind of how anti-Semitism is defined. And it's, I think one of the things that's most misunderstood about the First Amendment right to free speech is that even deplorable speech is protected speech. Like, you can't criminalize speech just because it's hateful, just because it's anti-Semitic, just because it's Islamophobic, and for good reason, and also some, with some bad consequences. Even despicable speech is protected. Anti-Semitic speech is protected. Islamophobic speech is protected. So this really falls under the category of, you have the right to say whatever you want, but you won't be free from the consequences of that, right? The government can't stop you, but there are consequences to your speech if you are saying things that are truly anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, deplorable. It's just that there's no real definition of what that is, and it's unfortunately protected from government interference.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on open concealed carry protests? We are in Michigan.
Don't do it at the University of Michigan, because it's against the law. You can't carry weapons on University of Michigan's campus. It's been challenged. It's been affirmed by the Court of Appeals. You can't open, you can't conceal. Don't bring a weapon on campus. Just don't do it. So I think that's the answer locally, and certainly with respect to universities that have those same ordinances. Generally speaking, I will just say this. I don't think that bringing a weapon to a politically charged protest is going to lead to any good consequences at all. I realize people feel unsafe. I realize that there is a lot of fear right now, and maybe some folks feel like they need it to protect themselves. I can tell you from my experience as a prosecutor, I just see far too many cases in which there is a verbal altercation, things get heated. And I'm not necessarily talking about the political side of things. This is just generally how shootings happen. And somebody pulls out a gun, and you've got somebody that's seriously injured or has lost their life, and another person who's facing potentially life in prison. So carrying a weapon, I mean, don't do it at the University of Michigan because it's illegal, but I'd really strongly encourage you to leave the weapons at home. I've seen virtually no situations, honestly, from the stuff that comes into our office, in which the possession of a weapon has allowed somebody to keep themselves safe. And I've seen far too many in which precisely the opposite has happened. So especially in heated times, especially when there's a possibility of verbal confrontations, leave the weapons out of it. Having a gun in a situation like that can change what may be a really horrible but temporary situation into something that has life and death consequences, and can alter the potential shooter's life forever, and end up with them behind bars. So really, please leave them at home. That's my personal plea, and it's also what the law says, again, with university.
Here we have question about language. What is the protection for language that is not anti-Semitic, but has recently begun to be labeled in that way, like from the river to the sea? And this is a question from someone noting that faculty at their private college have been reprimanded for using that slogan.
I think so. I think this goes back to the other question where anti-Semitic, it's really versus intent versus impact. There is a website, it's called, I don't want to give the name of the website because I don't want to draw any traffic to it, but there is a website that has a dictionary of quote unquote anti-Semitic terms. And they have added phrases like that one to it. And a lot of employers, it's actually the phrase that we saw in Bloomfield Hills High School that got people in trouble and got them assessed for terrorism threats. As a result of that, we know that there's no foundation for it. There's no historical context for it. We know that it's a slogan of liberation and not a slogan of anything else. It's absurd to say that calling for the liberation of one group is inherently calling for the annihilation of another. Like it's illogical and it doesn't really make sense. But if your words have impacted somebody and you have a private employer or you have a public employer that feels that those words are harmful and anti-Semitic in a way, there's nothing you can really do but fight that, give the facts for it, give the historical context for it, and kind of fight that out with them. Because how words are defined just in general are really, based on the impact that they have on the listener.
Thank you. Here's one more. And the question is, can one wear a keffiyeh proudly, or should you remove it at times, like an airport? And I take the question to basically refer to those moments where there's heightened security, heightened scrutiny, and the potential for those kinds of confrontations. If there's both, let's say, legal, but also perhaps non-legal advice that the three of you might have.
I can start since I'm wearing one this afternoon. I think that you need to think it through, is what I would say, especially in times, as Dr. Idris said, of heightened scrutiny. If you are willing to be pulled aside in the airport for, secondary random screening, you could wear your keffiyeh in the airport. And I think similar with even the previous question, from the river to the sea, the keffiyeh, all of these symbols have become demonized, and they have been turned into a negative symbol as opposed to a symbol of liberation and oppression, or liberation and freedom, which is the reason that people wear these the keffiyeh, or the chants that are being said. So I think it through. I wear mine proudly. I have no issues, even in the airport. If they want to stop me, they can stop me. But it really just, I would say it falls into like a personal decision if you're comfortable with potential scrutiny or potentially being stopped.
I just want to, plus one what Fadel said, because like I said earlier, Muslims are 10 plus times more likely to get stopped at the airport anyways, for secondary screening, both, for international flights, but also through TSA. And I'm a big pick your battles kind of person, right? What kind of, if you're wearing like the keffiyeh into the airport, what statement are you making? Who's your audience? What's the ramifications of that? Who's going to be hearing that? And what's going to be the impact of that political statement, quote unquote, that you're making, right? So we're picking our battles. We also know that people get put on, the selectee list, the watch list, for much less than making a political statement or irritating a TSA agent or a CBP officer. So You have to, weigh your pros and cons before we engage in certain types of activities where we already know we're going in with an identity that's going to have us more scrutinized anyways.
Great, thank you. We have around 5 minutes remaining, and let me see. And we have this question where the attendee thanks all the speakers for being here today, and especially Fadel for beginning by naming the atrocities being committed against the Palestinian people. And this is a question about police officers. Do they need to charge you with anything in order to justify detaining participants during a protest?
I see everybody wants to jump and answer that question. So I am going to give you a very lawyerly answer, and I'm going to say it depends on a lot of circumstances. So there's a difference between stopping you and doing like stopping you and finding out whether you're doing something harmful, just a brief interaction, versus actually being detained. And if in order to be detained, that's a much higher standard. If you're not free to go, right? That's what detainment means. That means the officer has approached you, you've identified yourself, and he is not allowing you to leave. They need reasonable suspicion to detain you. They can't just detain you because you're at a protest in the reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. My best advice is, if you're approached by law enforcement, remain calm. Ask them if you're free to leave. If you are free to leave, walk away. If they say you're not free to leave, tell them you're not answering any questions and you want your lawyer present. And most of the time, if they don't have a reason to arrest you, they're going to leave you alone and they're going to let you go about your business. And then if they do have a reason to continue to detain you, you just exercise your right. You affirmatively and consistently exercise your right to remain silent and ask for an attorney and any further questioning, because that's your rights once you're being detained.
I would agree with that, and then just to emphasize that charges are ultimately decided by the prosecutor's office. Law enforcement can submit charges. They don't have to submit charges. Sometimes they can decide, well, there's not enough evidence, or it's just not in the interest of justice to pursue charges, and then ultimately we review the case, or whatever the relevant prosecuting authority is reviews the case, reviews the evidence, reviews what comes in, and makes the decision. So it's not the case that there has to be a one-to-one between police action at the scene and ultimate charges later on. That's just sort of how our system works, and how charges end up being brought.
Great, thank you. And we'll make this the final question. Thank you for organizing this informative presentation. Are there any external or internal repercussions for online trolling or harassment from a college/university institutional account, such as a umich.edu account? If there's a lack of imminent threat in these institutional emails, is that considered free speech? The latter is cited from a UMich administrative response to students in previous racialized campus email harassment. Thank you.
Okay, so it's my turn to give the lawyerly answer. I think both of my colleagues on here know what I'm going to say. It depends. Certainly a threat would be one thing that could lead to both university disciplinary action as well as criminal action. Additionally, Amy pointed this out before, a continued course of unwanted conduct can give rise to a PPO, can give rise to potential stalking charges, and if it's continued, I would imagine, although I'm not an expert in the university's handbook, could also lead to adverse disciplinary action, but it depends both on what's being conveyed, as well as the frequency of it, how it's being conveyed, whether there's been an express request for somebody to stop contacting them, which is always something that you're looking for in these types of cases, at least from a criminal perspective. So it really does depend, but at bottom, the harassment, especially if it's a repeated course of conduct, there is stuff that can be done about that, whether at the university, at a civil PPO level, or potentially, again, depending on the facts and circumstances at a criminal level.
Wonderful. We are at 5:01. So I think we can say thank you to Amy, to Fadel, and to Ellie for taking this time and helping us think through and understand these issues during what is undoubtedly one of the most difficult times for many of us. Thank you all for being with us today. And we hope that you have a good